Hey there, Corporate Misfits. Brittany Darrington here, and welcome to episode 36 of the Corporate Misfit Podcast. I am so excited for today's Wednesday strategy session because we have a very special guest, and we're chatting all about how you can confidently get started with podcasting and your business. Our special guest is Krystal Proffitt, who is the founder of the Proffitt Podcast. This is where she helps entrepreneurs start, launch, and market their podcasts. Now, after 2 months of trying to figure out how to create a podcast, Krystal realized that other entrepreneurs have the exact questions that she did when starting. So she decided to dedicate her business to helping answer questions about podcasts and helping others to use this as a marketing tool in their business. So if you are ready to learn all about podcasting, then you're in the right place. Let's go ahead and dive right in.
You're listening to the Corporate Misfit Podcast with Brittany Darrington, where female entrepreneurs can get powerful tips and advice on how to start, launch, and grow their business.
Krystal, I am so excited to have you on the Corporate Misfit Podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. This is awesome. I'm excited. Brittany and I were just chatting. We found out we're both right in Houston. So I'm looking forward to meeting up with you in person.
Yes, me too. I always love when I find other people in the same city because even though we're in Houston, it's so big. And sometimes I'm like, are there any other entrepreneurs out there? Are there any other people who can even relate to me or talk to me about podcasting and life and all that good stuff? And most of the time, I always think I'm all on my own here.
Yes. Oh, same. Oh my gosh. Same. Totally.
Well, I am so excited to hear how you became a corporate misfit and most of all, on how you got started with your podcast. So if you can you give us an overview on what you do and how you help entrepreneurs with podcasting?
Okay, so I was thinking about this earlier because when I think of a corporate misfit, I have to go back many years because I feel like I have been a stay-at-home mom since 2013. I think that's right. 2013, 2014. But I left my corporate job and it was, oh my gosh, Brittany, I was so miserable. It was one of those things where everyone told you like, you're so good at what you do. Like you're awesome. But I was like inside, I was dying. Like I was dying inside. I hated what I did. So I was an accountant. I was basically a glorified bookkeeper for a large construction company. And I loved what I did when I was helping people. I was told, you're so good at helping people. You're like this. And like, it just, it was an ego boost for me because people were saying, you're doing such a good job. You're doing such a good job. But I didn't like the work. I did not like the work. And then my husband and I, with his job, we relocated and I realized I didn't have to work anymore. Mm-hmm. And so instead of, doing this soul sucking work, that was just like, it wasn't that it was super challenging. It was just that it didn't fulfill me. And so with that being said, I started staying at home and I started exploring ways that I could fulfill myself. And so I find that entrepreneurism just kind of like fulfills all those things, but holy moly, I don't even know how you prepare someone to be an entrepreneur. I don't even know, like, is there a manual for that?
No, I always tell people there's no manual. And that's why I am really big on like helping educate people on entrepreneurship, because a lot of people tell you what they hear from school or what they see from a book. And I'm like, no. If you're going to learn about entrepreneurship, you need to learn from another entrepreneur who can actually show you the ins and the outs, because a book is not going to always tell you how to get there. And that's what I'm saying. Like you're never going to be prepared for entrepreneurship until you go into it.
Right. I mean, and so that's exactly where my story kind of happened. Is I was dumped into this role of being a stay-at-home mom. I had 2 boys and I was just, okay. And I'm kind of like, go in or go home, like go all in, like 100,000%, or, and so I just became obsessed with I'm going to be the best stay-at-home mom there is. And then, oh my gosh, I was so burned out. Like everything was Pinterest perfect and I was cooking Pioneer Woman meals and I was doing all this stuff. But again, I found myself, I wasn't fulfilled. And like, oh my gosh, as women, we're not supposed to say that. You're not supposed to say, because I had the dream job, right? Like being a stay-at-home mom. This is what so many women, my close personal friends have told me, like I would give anything to stay at home with my babies. So it's not like I could raise my hand and say, I'm not 100% fulfilled. And so I didn't really say anything. I just kept doing what I was doing, but I started exploring other things. So I wrote an ebook. I had started writing, and then I wrote a book. I published it. It's on Amazon, but it was a devotional book. And that's how I got into writing and trying to figure things out. And while I was staying at home, I started blogging. And then I followed a blogger who was just crushing it. She was killing it. She still does amazing things to this day. But then I saw her start a podcast. And I thought, because before, like, I don't know about you, like how long you've been a consumer of podcasts, but oh my gosh, I've been listening to Dave Ramsey and Christy Wright and like all these big business people for many years. And I saw this, she's just a blogger, kind of like, like who is she to start a podcast? And so that was when the idea first got planted in me last year. Like, maybe I can do this too. And so that's kind of where this journey just happened. Like this entrepreneur, like I just kept trying things. Like I was like, okay, I'm going to write a book. I'm going to start blogging. Blogging is a lot harder than people, you have the people that you see online. They're like, oh, I've got, 5 million views every month. And I have this. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're just going to try blogging, that is not how it works. Like you've got to put the time in. It's just like podcasting. So yeah, that's kind of where it is today. I've had just so many friends that are entrepreneurs that have asked, well, how do you do this podcasting thing? So last year I decided that I'm going to create a course that teaches people how to start, launch, and market a podcast. And then that kind of transformed into me rebranding my current podcast or my previous podcast into what it is today, which is the Proffitt Podcast. And I'm just having so much fun. So again, like I'm staying at home still. And even earlier today, like I feel like I'm living the dream life while it's also chaotic and insane having 3 kids home for the summer. Oh my gosh. But I went bowling with my kids earlier today. And it's like, you can't do that if you have a 9-to-5, go sit in a cubicle, go sit in a desk kind of job. So sorry, that's like my short synopsis of my entrepreneur journey.
I love it because, one of the things that sometimes we get caught up in is, okay, well, society tells me that my life should be great because I'm doing this, but like you mentioned, you were unfulfilled and you wanted to do more. And I believe that you could be a mom and start your business. I'm really huge on that. And I know a lot of other people who teach on business as well. If they are family people, they share that too. You can have a family and you can also build a business. But I also love that you decided to explore. You went from blogging, you went from recipes and things like that, and mixing things up. And then you found that thing that lights you up, which is podcasting.
Yes.
So there are so many people who consume so much information from podcasts. I am one of them. And they start to think, maybe I should implement this into my business. Maybe I should start a podcast. But then the number one thing that comes up, or the most common thing that comes up, is how do I do this? What do I do? How do I get started? This is crazy. It's techie. So how did you get started with your podcast? How did you get started with helping other people with a podcast? Because that's usually the first question most people receive when it comes to podcasts.
Right. And so I think that with anyone that wants to have an online business or an online presence of any sort, you have 3 options, right? It's you're either going to blog, you're going to podcast, or you're going to have a YouTube channel. Like that is what, you got to give out free content. You need to add value to your audience, right? Because that's our goal. Like we are doing this to help our audiences and to give them value and deliver value. Now, if someone were to come to me and say, how do I start a podcast? It's almost like kind of like a cringeworthy question, because I want to say, well, you have to decide if podcasting is right for you, because it's not right for everybody. If you don't like to talk, if you aren't comfortable sitting in a room, okay, I was telling Brittany earlier, I guess I'll just tell y'all, I'm in my closet recording right now. And so I record a lot of my podcast in my closet by myself, and I'm just talking into a microphone, sharing my thoughts, reading off of, my outlines that I create. And if you're not comfortable doing those kind of things, then podcasting may not be for you. Maybe you're more of a blogger, or maybe you like turning on the video camera and just talking into it, and you're a YouTuber. And I think that that's awesome. But when it comes to deciding what you want to do, like you've got to choose one, because let me tell you, if you are trying to do all the things, the only reason why I say this is I speak from experience, you're going to get burned out. I tried blogging, and then I tried YouTubing and blogging. Like I've done them all. I have done them all. And I didn't see a lot of traction with blogging. I didn't see a lot of traction with YouTube. And so I thought, well, why don't we try podcasting? So if you were to come to me, Brittany, and say, okay, Krystal, let's just pretend you're on day one. You're like, I want to do this entrepreneur thing. I don't know what to do. Like, because that's what everyone does, is like, you have this big, grandiose dream of how you want your life to be, but then you're like, where do I get started? Like, I don't even know what to do. The first thing is pick one thing that you want to talk about. I think where a lot of people go wrong is, I'm part of a lot of podcasting groups, and there's so many people that are saying, well, we can't get a lot of traction on our podcast. And then I see a lot of people, the questions come rolling in. Well, what's your podcast about? Oh, it's about boxing and men telling dad jokes and like fishing and, doing all these things. And like, some of those things are related, but most of the time it's confusing to your audience. So if Brittany, you were to come to me and say, I want to start a podcast, you have done an amazing job, because you're here. Like, this is Corporate Misfit. You are talking about kind of running away from that corporate lifestyle that everyone tells you, from when you're younger, you go, you get good grades in high school, then you go to a great college, and then you get a great corporate job where you sit in a cubicle and you rot away.
That is exactly what I think of when I think about the corporate world. Sometimes I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't do it. Yes.
Oh like, and that's like, it's really hard to step away from that and admit that you want something more, or that, I don't know if you've had this feeling, but you're sitting in a cubicle, or you're sitting, just at your desk, and you're just thinking like, is this really all I'm going to be doing for the next 40, 50 years of my life? And, you just have that moment of like, it's kind of, what else is out there kind of thing. And so with podcasting, I don't think that you have to quit your job and say, oh, I'm just going to go start a podcast and I'm going to make millions of dollars. Please do not do that. Oh my gosh, do not do that. Because when it comes to podcasting, you have to pick one thing to focus on. That is totally key. And then I think the next biggest thing is to plan. I'm talking about spending an entire month. Like, don't just say, I'm going to create a podcast and then launch it next week, because most of the time it's not going to be successful. I'm not saying, that's like, there's always one that does some, there's always a Kardashian out there that does something, and it just blows up. But take some time and really plan your content, plan how you're going to have a setup. Like you said, podcasting is a little techie and people get very intimidated. And I think that from all the women that I speak to that say they want to start a podcast, the technology is the number one thing holding them back. So, we can talk about that for a second, or we can talk about something else if you had another question about that. But
yeah, I definitely agree, first off, with planning things out. I know when I decided to start a podcast, one of the things I wanted to focus on was entrepreneurship, helping people escape the 9-to-5 and share their stories, and also give some business strategies for those newer entrepreneurs so that they can get started and actually have that support that they need. It took a while, though, to really identify exactly what I was going to focus on, because I was like, oh, I have so many aspects to my business. I can talk about branding. I can talk about, finding funding for your business. I could talk about this, that, and this. But like you said, when you take time to really plan out, what is it that you want to achieve? What is your goal? It makes it so much easier to get started. But a lot of people get stuck right there. They get stuck in trying to implement, like you said, all these different topics that then when someone comes on, they're like, whoa, this is all over the place. Like, what is this person talking about? I can't keep up.
Right. Exactly.
Now,
Well,
oh, go ahead.
no, I was just going to say, if you were to ask me, like, Krystal, what did you learn in the first 6 months of your podcast? The number one thing, first of all, I know this sounds silly, but it's true. Always make sure your microphone's plugged in. Okay. That's number one. Number two is always have at least a month to 2 months planned ahead. And the reason is, and that doesn't mean it's done. That doesn't mean you sit down and you record 2 months worth of episodes. I'm talking about just the idea, because when you're in that reactive mindset of, oh my gosh, I have to, like, what am I going to talk about next week? Or I have to have an episode up. It's due tomorrow. Like, what am I going to do? Like, you're in this like just panic mode. Y'all, it's not fun. It is not. And I can speak from experience because that is how I lived through the first few months of my podcast. It was just so reactive. So I just cannot emphasize enough on the planning. Like right now it's June and I have episodes planned out through November of this year because I know myself and I know that I creatively work better when I know what's ahead and I can plan out for it. And I'm sure you know this too, but it's just like, when you know what's coming down the road, you have an opportunity to get more excited about it and really hype up, like, oh, you had a question about branding? Well, we're going to be talking about that, in a few weeks, like just hang on. And it's almost like a way to keep your audience engaged as opposed to confusing them, jumping around from like many different topics.
Absolutely. I know when I first started, I interviewed 52 women on how they quit their 9 to 5 in like a 2-week time frame. And what you mentioned is about batching and kind of planning ahead. But trust me when I say, if you don't plan ahead, you will be stressed out, pulling your hair out. You'll be going crazy. And then also you'll find that your content that you're giving is not that high quality that you want to, because you're rushing in your panic mode. So I love that you're mentioning this because it is so true. And so many people think they're going to just wing it. And all of a sudden they start running into moments where they don't have anything to talk about. They're not sure what they want to focus on, and they can't really build their content around what's happening in their business because it's always on the whim. So I love actually planning things out. But as you mentioned, the tech side is what scares the heck out of people. I know for my own self, when I was thinking about starting, I was like, oh my gosh, how do I get it uploaded to iTunes, to shop the Spotify, Stitcher, and Google Play, and all these different things? I was like, how do I do this? And that was one of the reasons that I did not want to move forward with the podcast for so long. So what do you recommend for someone who is not tech, not in love with tech, and they're kind of freaking out, and this is what's holding them back from actually moving forward with the podcast?
Well, I would like to share, first of all, kind of some of the myths. Like, let me debunk some of the myths here. So the first is you do not have to have super fancy equipment, period, the end. I don't care what anybody else says out there. You can record things on your iPhone. Like I just spoke with an audio engineer last week and he was like, oh, there's an amazing, if you have an Android, I don't know, I don't remember what the name of it was off the top of my head, but there is an iPhone app called Backpack. It's like Backpack Studio, and you can record directly on your phone and it's like $10. So you don't have to have anything super fancy. You don't have to have a crazy setup. So that is myth number one. Myth number two is you have to upload everything to all these places. So you mentioned, iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Play, like all these. You don't. You have one place, and that is your podcast hosting site. So what that is we'll just imagine it. It's where your podcast lives on the internet. It is where you upload information about yourself. You upload your episodes every week or whenever you publish, and that's where you get everything connected. So when you upload a new episode, that is where it goes. And honestly, those are the basic things you need to know, because I could go into, recording software and this and that. So if you think back to, your high school, middle school days, or whenever you learned something like PowerPoint, right? Like it's so basic to us now because we've been using it for 20 plus years, or however long you've been using it. But you think back to those very first days when the teacher was telling you the very basics. Okay, you hit file, you go to save, and that is how you save something. It's kind of the same way with teaching someone, Audacity. That is the recording and editing software I use for my podcast. And so when I'm teaching it to someone, I don't teach it to them, like they're a fourth grader or, obviously, but I let them know, like, just take a deep breath and give yourself some grace. It's going to be a learning curve. You're not going to know this overnight. Why? Because you were never taught this. Why would you ever be taught a recording software? And so I think that having all of the important things like the planning and knowing your why are you doing this podcast? Why is it important? Why are you wanting to build this community in this platform? And just knowing what kind of content you're going to produce, that's all the important stuff. Like the editing, you can outsource the editing, guys. Like if you don't want to do that, I have met in the last 2 weeks, I think there's been like 5 podcast editors that have reached out to me and they're like, hey, can we help you out? Or can we talk, can I give you some quotes on stuff? So they're out there. If that just absolutely like freaks you out and just scares you, then you don't have to do it. I know there's a lot of virtual assistants. There's actually people that's all they do. So when it comes to doing the recording and the editing, don't let it freak you out, guys. Like we're in the age of the internet. You can YouTube it. I have some tutorials that I would love to share with you completely free and just show you like, it's not that hard. I can tell you if I can figure this out, so can you. 100%.
That's what I love to say too, because I am the same way. I'm like, well, first of all, I'm going to be very honest for everyone who even listens to this. I usually am the person who will do the talking. I'll do all that kind of stuff. And I'm like, let's collaborate with this person. But I'm not the one who's behind the scenes editing. I'm not the one uploading. So I'm like kind of guilty of that. I don't know what's going on behind the scenes. But one thing I do know though, is don't make it complicated. And
yes.
So just like what you said, don't make it complicated. Work with what you have and don't try to get all this fancy equipment and expect it to be perfect right away. I know my first podcast to my current podcast are night and day, but I started off and I just took the first step. And at the end of the day, that's how you get better. That's how you move forward. That's how you get to the next level. And if you're not willing to take the first step, then you'll never be able to get past some of the awful moments that might come along in the world of podcasting and whatnot to get to being an amazing podcaster.
Well, and I love that you say that because I have my own moments. Like I said, number one, like the thing, you got to plug in your microphone. There's a reason why I say that. I conducted my entire first interview. My microphone was unplugged, guys. Like, oh my gosh. And then I had to go back and thankfully my guest, like everything she recorded was amazing. And I just went back and kind of inserted. So it's very choppy. It's terrible. Oh my gosh. But I leave that out there because I tell people like, this is where I started, but I kept going. You just got to keep going. Like there's episodes where there's a bunch of, there's echoes or there's background noises or there's children busting in the room. I have one interview where I just left it in there because I let people know like, hey, like this is real life. I'm recording. I'm a mom. I'm at home with my kids. I'm not in a $50,000 studio, in a corporate building somewhere. Like this is my life and this is how I do it because I want other people to know you can do this too. If I can do this and I can figure this out, you can too.
Absolutely. I totally agree. And I'm glad that you shared that because again, people try to focus on being perfect. Can't speak, see? So many people really focus on being perfect instead of just getting it out there and giving the information and helping to serve their clients or provide value to their clients. Now, one of the things that a lot of people kind of get fearful of, especially when it comes to podcasting, is how often do I need to put a podcast episode out there? Do I need to put it out there every day? Because there's some podcasters who do that. There's some people who do, once a week. I know I do 3 times a week. But how often, if someone's just getting started, should they put their podcast episodes out into the podcast world?
I would recommend, well, first of all, if you're going to launch your podcast, this is very important. If you're thinking about podcasting, the launch is kind of a big deal because when you put it out there and you just have one episode, people are kind of like, okay, yeah, I guess, this is cool. This, maybe I could tune into this again. But if you're going to launch, I suggest launching with 3 to 5 episodes at one time. And then publishing at least once a week. And now, Brittany mentioned earlier about batching. Batching is the best thing in the world because especially if your episodes aren't super long, if they're and I don't recommend anything really over an hour because if you think about the typical consumer that's listening to your show, it's going to be, in the car or while they're working out or something. It's usually 30 minutes to an hour is the typical, the average listening time. So I would recommend batching them all. Do it in one day. Set aside 4 hours if you can, or 2 hours one day and 2 hours the next day, whatever you have to do, but batch 4 episodes at one time. And then you can spend more of your free time or more of your focused energy on marketing those. So this is the part that I love. I could totally geek out on some marketing. This is what I went to school for. I have my marketing degree. And I was so upset because I didn't really use it after I got out of school. And now I'm like, oh, you want to talk about marketing? It's so much fun. But anyway, so I would recommend at least once a week. If you can do more than that, then I've seen studies that show that you are going to be top of mind more often for your audience, and that the ones that produce every single day, like they're rocking it, like they have tons of downloads and they have, so many listeners that come back, but it's a lot of work. If you're a one-woman show, I don't recommend doing a daily show. It's too much for one person to do all the editing, all the promoting, just all the things. I say, if you're going to start somewhere, start with 1 episode a week at the very minimum.
I agree. I think doing anything more than 1 episode, and again, I always have to remind people, the reason why I do a lot more episodes than 1 a week is because I have somebody helping me to do it because I'm not doing it. But being able to just release 1 podcast a week, whether it's, 30 minutes to an hour, I think it's so doable, and it can definitely replace if you're not wanting to do a blog anymore, if you're not doing a YouTube channel or things along those lines, it can definitely replace those. And you could do it in that time frame. How much time should someone dedicate to building their podcast and getting in front of their audience and recording? Like, what's an average kind of time frame that an entrepreneur can really dedicate to getting their podcast up and going and really thriving?
So if you're just starting, like I said, give yourself some grace on figuring out all the technology and doing all that. But let's say you've kind of gotten over that hump. You're comfortable with everything. You know where everything goes and you're past the learning curve. I would say either 1 hour a day or 5 hours a week. I think that that's very reasonable. And now that's not meaning you're recording every day and you're editing every day. Like I said, I'm very big on the marketing side of things because you can create this amazing show, but if it's just you and your mom listening to it, then, come on, you're probably going to get burned out or you're going to get frustrated. So I would encourage people to, maybe that's time spent, like maybe you set aside an hour a week to be in social media groups, like at Facebook groups where you're like, hey, what questions are out there? Like maybe your hour today is spent on coming up with content ideas for the next month. And then maybe the next day you're promoting something. And then the next day you're looking to be guests on other people's shows. And then the next day you are creating graphics or audiograms or something to promote your show. So what I love about podcasting is no week, like every week is totally different. I don't know if you can speak to that, but I've had interviews where, I spoke with a woman in Germany and it was just so crazy, to have this time difference and this cultural difference, but then we had so many similarities and we were able to connect. And then to speak with you, I mean, you were just right down the road. Come on.
I was like, what? We should have met up in person. We should meet up in person for this one.
But I mean, it's so cool what I love about podcasting is just meeting people that I never would have had the opportunity. So if you're in that stage where you're like, should I have a blog? Should I have a podcast? Should I have a YouTube? Let me just say, a lot of YouTubers don't necessarily do a lot of interviews, and a lot of blogs. I've done interviews for a blog. It does not resonate with people the same as hearing someone's voice, hearing them and connecting with them and listening to that human emotion it's just, oh, there's just nothing like it. Y'all, I'm just a total podcast geek. You have to forgive me. This is just, I'm so passionate about it.
I love it because podcasts are the hot and happening thing. So I love that you're sharing about this, because a lot of people have had this in the back of their head and they're like, I want to get going, but I just don't know how. So I know you love to talk about marketing and getting your podcast out there. And that is also just like launching a business, launching a product, launching a service. You have to put it out there, or it's going to be you and your mom listening to the podcast and you're going to get frustrated, or you launched to crickets. So what are some steps that you think people should take when they are just getting started with their podcast? They recorded their first 3 episodes to launch with, or 4 episodes to launch with. What do you recommend they do in order to put themselves out there and get in front of their audience, or get in front of more people, just in case they don't have necessarily that audience out there yet?
So I would say that there's 3 things that I would recommend. The first one is planning, because people, they're going to ask you, if you put it out into the world, you know, hey, I'm starting a podcast. They're going to say, well, what is your podcast about? And if you just kind of blankly stare at them, they're going to think, well, this chick has no idea what she's talking about. So I don't really know that I want to listen to her. But if you already have in the back of your mind either who you've interviewed or who you'd like to interview or the things that you'd like to talk about, you know, all the planning that you've done ahead of time, it's really going to pay off, because you're going to look like you know what you're doing. And so that's step number 1. So you want to make sure that you plan. Number 2 is you want to invite people onto your show that are aligned with what you're doing. So your cousin, Brittany, may say, oh, well, I have this little boutique, you know, that I sell my clothes and I would love to advertise it on your podcast. Well, if you talk about cooking, then you're going to be like, oh, you don't want to hurt her feelings, right? Because it's your cousin. But at the same time, if your values don't align or your message doesn't align, then it's going to be kind of a hard sell to your audience. Again, it's going to confuse them. So you want to really stick with one topic, one main thing that you're going to talk about, and you want to ask guests who have similar audience to come onto your show. And this can be kind of a challenge if you're just getting started. You're like, oh, I've got, where do you find these people? Where do you, you know, how do I know where they are? And
that's what I was about to ask you too. Like, how do people go about finding people and collaborating?
Yes. You know, and the best thing that I have found is, there's 2 little tricks I'm going to teach you real fast. So go into Facebook groups for sure. Whatever you do, there's a Facebook group out there for it. I promise you. And if you announce, hey, I'm starting a podcast, then hey, I need some guests. You may not get as qualified of people. So, you know, like that's my cautionary tale, is you may have someone that they sound great on paper, but then it ends up being not a great interview. So just keep that in mind. That is one way to do it. But another way, and this is actually how I found Brittany, is go into iTunes or whatever player that that you prefer, where you listen to podcasts, and start looking at categories that you want to be connected with. So for me, it was business. And then I could look in marketing, I could look in management, I could look anywhere within the business spectrum. And I found like-minded women that have the same kind of audience as me. So entrepreneurship, check. You know, like Corporate Misfit, you mostly talk to women, like check. You know, so I was just like this checklist that I had. And I wanted to come on your show because I just think that a lot of our values align. Mm-hmm. So if you could get people to come onto your show that already have a platform, and then you turn around and say, hey, will you share this with your audience? I would love to have you come on the show. Will you please share this message with your audience? That's a great way to grow too. And then the third thing would be promote. And so what I mean by that is you can start a Facebook group for your podcast. You can post pictures that are on your social media, you know, whether it's an actual graphic with words on it about what, you know, a quotable that you had from your interview, or it's, you know, something on Instagram that's eye-catching, and then you're discussing what you're talking about or your topic. Like, use social media. It is free and it is a lot of work. Like, I will say that, like, it's not easy to be all the places all the time, and don't try to be. Try to figure out where your audience is. And if you don't exactly know who your audience is just yet, start talking to the people that you want to be like part of your audience. Does that make sense? Like,
absolutely. And I love that you mentioned to use social media, and you could build that into that 5-hour time frame that you have per
yes.
week. You can build that social media time into your actual plan of action. So you can just add on, okay, I'm going to add more clips, or I'm going to make some images that relate to my podcast and use that. And yeah, social media is free. Like,
yes.
that's what people don't get there. It's free, and you could either use it two ways. You could use it to just talk about nothing and not get what you want, or you could use it and get what you want. So you decide on what you want from that. And I love that you have helped make this so much easier for people to understand and just get started with a podcast.
Well, and I love taking, my number one goal is to take the overwhelm out of it, because I get it. I've been there. I've been right where someone is. Like, if you're listening right now and you're thinking, I kind of think I want to do this, but I'm not 100% sure. Like, I've been there, because you look at all the moving parts and it's all overwhelming. It's funny. This is like a little quick side story. I had this 1,000-piece puzzle. It was a jigsaw puzzle, and it's super dorky. I don't even know why I brought it out, but I was like, it's summertime. I need to do something with my mind. And so I did it, and it was so hard. Oh my gosh. Just flipping over all the pieces probably took me an hour just to flip them over. And that's how I look at podcasting. It's such a silly metaphor, but it's so true, because you look at it and you're like, okay, what if I just found the corner pieces? So for you, what if that was, I just bought a microphone? What if I just do that one step? And then the next part of the puzzle is, okay, I'm going to do the border. Okay. So for you, it was, what if I find a program like Audacity or something and start to get comfortable with it? And then the next part, you move on to a section of it. So you're not going to sit down and do the entire puzzle, and you're not going to sit down and know how to podcast in a day. Unless you're a freaking genius, like, it's not going to happen. And so give yourself that grace. And I know I've said that. This is what I have to do with myself. Because when I start feeling overwhelmed, like, oh, I should have all of this figured out. Like, I should be podcasting like Pat Flynn. If you don't know who he is, like, he is the Mac Daddy of podcasters, right? Like, he's been around for 10 years. And so I find myself, like, I compare myself. Like, I'm like, oh, well, I should have this and I should have that. And it's like, Krystal, hold on. You've only been doing this for a year. Like, calm down, give yourself some grace, and just keep moving, because you're only on like a little sliver of the puzzle. I know that sounds so dorky, but I'm totally going to use the puzzle metaphor from now on.
So true, because again, a lot of people will compare their chapter 1 to someone's chapter 100 or 50 or whatever. But like you mentioned, like, I know when I first thought about getting started, I listened to Pat Flynn and I was like, oh my gosh, how did he do this? And one of the things that he always says is always go back to his first 15 to 20 episodes. And he was like, you will see that I just got started, and you will be able to tell that I was not who I am today, but over time I evolved and grew. And so it's really powerful just to get started, and just know, like you mentioned, give yourself grace during this process. No one wakes up and knows exactly how to use the podcast platform overnight. It takes time. And as you continue to keep trying and putting yourself out there, you will eventually get really comfortable with using the system, doing interviews, or just hearing your voice and putting it out into the world. You'll feel more comfortable as you continue to keep doing it. So I love that. Giving yourself grace is so important. And I totally stand behind that 100%.
Well, I have to say something real fast, because you mentioned it, but y'all, if you decide you're going to podcast, you have to get used to your voice, and not because you listen to it. I mean, I'm sure, like Brittany, you said you have someone to help you, but holy moly, just hearing your voice over and over and over again, you get better, because you realize, oh, I say too much, or I breathe too heavily, or I do these things. You get better at public speaking. So if your idea down the road is to become a public speaker, man, podcasting is a great way to get started, because you don't have to publish everything if you don't like it. You can sit in your closet and speak into a microphone, and if it's terrible, then don't publish it. You don't have to publish it, but it's a great way to just practice and get going.
I completely agree. And I totally agree with that 100%, especially for people who want to go into speaking and use that as a marketing tool in their business. It will help you to eliminate some of the ums, and you hear words like, oh my goodness, I said this word like 5 times in a row. I need to start using different words, or I need to change it up. Maybe my questions are too vague. I need to be more specific. And you learn that as you go, but that's
over time, for sure.
Getting started and getting into it versus sitting back and thinking you have to be perfect just to get started.
Right.
So, love this. This is an excellent conversation because again, podcasting is so popular. So if someone wants to get started with podcasting and they're like, how do I stay connected with Krystal? How do I learn more about her course? Where can they find you?
Okay, so I'm going to spell my name for you because it's one of those where people are like, okay, is there 2 F's, 2 T? Like, okay, Krystal is with a K, and I always say this on the podcast too. So it's Krystal with a K, so Krystal, and then my last name is Proffitt, Proffitt. And you can find me at krystalproffitt.com. And then you can find me on all the social media platforms at Krystal Proffitt TX, because I'm Texas proud. It's just, that's just how we are. And
I'm with you. So, I'm Texas proud with you. And we do things bigger and better here in Texas.
Yes. You can find me. No, go ahead.
I was going to say, Krystal, what piece of advice would you give to those new entrepreneurs who are not necessarily new entrepreneurs, but people who are looking to just get started with podcasting and bringing that into their business? What would you give them? What advice would you give them?
So I'm going to give you a specific tool that you can find it at krystalproffitt.com/start here. And what that is the framework for my podcast is called the Proffitt Podcast. And the framework of that is to teach entrepreneurs how to start, launch, and market their podcast. So what you'll find here is the exact steps that I walk you through. That's like, okay, you have to do these and you have to do them in order. It's not like a jigsaw puzzle where you can just kind of figure it out as you go. Because like I said, planning is such a big part of it. So if you can just kind of swallow that pill, like from day one, and understand that the more you plan, I promise you, the easier podcasting will come for you. And it will just help like ease you through that learning curve. Cause like I said, no one knows how to do any of this stuff. You don't know unless you are in, broadcast journalism and you've been on a radio show forever, you don't know how to do a podcast. So just give yourself some grace and just know it's going to take a while. But if you have any questions, I'm always here. I would love for you to reach out to me. Hit me up on social media, shoot me an email, whatever you feel most comfortable with, but please reach out. Don't sit in the dark saying, I have no idea how to do this and feel all alone, because you don't need to do that.
Totally agree. Well, Krystal, I am so grateful to have you on the Corporate Misfit podcast. Thank you so much for sharing your podcast wisdom with us and sharing how we can get started with the podcast and implement it into our business and use that as a power tool for marketing and to get ourselves out there. So thank you again for your time and for sharing your wisdom with us today.
Yes, thank you so much for having me, Brittany.
If you've enjoyed today's episode of the Corporate Misfit podcast, we invite you to check out the Corporate Misfit Club. The Corporate Misfit Club is the essential resource for female entrepreneurs who are looking to start or grow a business they actually love. Whether you are a seasoned entrepreneur in your startup phase or simply thinking about taking the leap into entrepreneurship, we've got your back, girl. With our extensive course library, monthly training, exclusive members-only discount perks, and unlimited tools. We also have a supportive community of women where our members share stories, experiences, their wins, and business tips. The Corporate Misfit Club is the perfect place to be to start, launch, or grow a business. So check it out at corporatemisfitclub.com.